There is a place at the edge of the world where the sky itself has weight, where stone shoulders have borne an impossible burden for 10,000 years, and where a single titan's exhaustion has become the foundation of all existence. Before we continue, if you'd like to join me for more stories like this, feel free to subscribe. I share a new one every day. And if you don't mind, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how far these stories travel. In the beginning, there was chaos. Not the chaos of disorder, but the chaos of infinite potential, a swirling void before form, before law, before consequence. The ancient Greeks understood this. They called it chaos, and they said that from that primordial emptiness came Gaia, the earth, and Uranus, the sky. These were not shy deities who hid themselves in temples and distant heavens. They were the very substance of the world. Gaia was the ground beneath your feet. Uranus was the air in your lungs and the vault above your head. They were fundamental, irreducible, everywhere and nowhere at once. The cosmos, in those first ages, was unlike anything that would come later. There were no humans to observe it, no mortals to wonder at the arrangement of stars. There was only the raw substance of existence, earth and sky and sea, separated and balanced in a configuration that had somehow emerged from absolute nothing. How this happened, the Greeks did not entirely know, and they were honest about it. Their creation myths did not attempt to answer every question. They simply said, from chaos came these things, and they began to shape the world. From the union of Gaia and Uranus came the Titans' 12 mighty beings who dwarfed all that would come later. They were older than the gods of Olympus, older than humanity, older than the very concept of right and wrong. They were born into a cosmos that still had no laws, a reality in which the rules were being written, even as they came into existence. The Titans included Oceanus, god of the waters that encircled the world; Themis, goddess of divine law; Mnemosyne, goddess of memory; and many others whose names have faded from common remembrance, but who shaped the early world nonetheless. Among them stood Iapetus, a Titan of the second generation, a being of profound intellect and foresight. It was said that his name meant to pierce or to wound, a fitting title for one whose children would bring both fire and suffering to mankind. But Iapetus himself was not malevolent. He was simply present, existing in an age before moral judgment had been fully invented. He stood tall among the other Titans, neither the strongest nor the most beloved, but respected for his counsel and his ability to see patterns in the chaos of becoming. Iapetus took as his wife Clymene, an Oceanid one of the 3,000 daughters of Oceanus, god of the waters that encircled the world. Their union was fruitful, producing 4 sons, Menetius, Epimetheus, Prometheus, and Atlas. Each would leave his mark upon the cosmos, but none more profoundly than Atlas. Menetius was hot-tempered and rash, the kind of being who acted before thinking. Epimetheus, whose name meant afterthought, was given to reconsidering decisions long after he had made them, always wondering if he should have chosen differently. Prometheus, whose name meant forethought, possessed the ability to see what would come, to understand the future before it arrived. And then there was Atlas, the eldest, the mightiest, the one who seemed born to carry impossible weight. Atlas was born in an age when the world was still settling into its shape. The Titans ruled all things. Kronos sat as king of his siblings, and the younger gods had not yet been born to challenge them. It was an age of power without question, of strength without constraint. In such an age, Atlas grew to his full stature. He was the greatest of Iapetus's sons, a being of such tremendous strength that the earth itself seemed smaller beneath him. The ancients said he could see to the edges of the world. They said his hands were large enough to hold mountains, his back strong enough to bear any weight. They said he was brave, unflinching, and utterly loyal to his father's cause. From his birth, Atlas was marked by his physicality. He grew taller than his brothers, broader in the shoulders, more massive in his limbs. Other Titans watched his development with interest. Here was a being, they said, who was built for greatness. Here was one who would shape the cosmos itself. The younger gods, those who would eventually come to challenge Kronos, were not yet born. The universe was still being decided, still being arranged, according to principles that were not yet fully established. Atlas received an education befitting his status as a Titan's son. He learned the secrets of creation, the ways in which the cosmos held itself together. He studied the movements of the stars, the cycles of the seasons, the flow of waters across the earth. The elder Titans taught him that order was all that chaos could return at any moment if the proper structures were not maintained. They taught him that strength was not merely physical might, but the will to maintain structure, to hold things in their proper places, to resist entropy and disorder. For many years, the Titans and their offspring lived in relative peace. If peace is the right word for an epoch in which such beings merely had not yet chosen to war with each other. Atlas distinguished himself as a warrior and a counselor. He organized the forces of his father's faction. He led expeditions to the far corners of the world. He was thoughtful in his way, not prone to the wild rages of some of his kind. He believed in order, in structure, in the proper arrangement of things. He was the kind of being who could imagine a cosmos and work to bring it about. There are stories of Atlas in these early ages, before the Great War. Some say he journeyed to the north, where the world grew cold and strange, and there he learned the secrets of the night sky. Others say he traveled to the depths of the sea with his cousin Oceanus and learned the patterns of the tides. Still others claim he spent time with the Cyclopes, learning the techniques of craft and building. These stories paint a picture of a young Titan exploring the world, trying to understand its nature, preparing himself for the role he would eventually play. But change came, as it always does, even in the realm of immortals. Zeus and his siblings, Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Poseidon, and Hades, were born to Kronos and Rhea. These were new gods, younger gods, gods with different ideas about power and authority. They were born not in the Titan realm itself, but in a cave on the island of Crete, hidden away from their father's sight. Kronos, fearing his own offspring as he had feared his father Uranus before him, attempted to prevent their rise by swallowing them whole. He took each child from Rhea and consumed them, believing this act of consumption would prevent them from ever becoming threats to his authority. But Rhea, in desperation and cleverness, tricked him. When Zeus was born, she wrapped a stone in swaddling clothes and presented it to Kronos as the infant god. Kronos, assuming it was his child, swallowed the stone without hesitation. The real child, Zeus, survived in hiding, growing in strength and power while his father believed him destroyed. Eventually, when Zeus was old enough, he freed his siblings from within Kronos' body. The stone forced its way back up and out, and together they challenged their father for control of the cosmos. This was the beginning of the Titanomachi, the War of the Titans. It was not a brief conflict that could be resolved in a few battles. It was a struggle that raged for 10 years, shaking the very foundations of creation. This was not a mortal war, where men fought with swords and arrows and fell by the thousands. This was a war fought by beings of cosmic power, where a single blow could shake mountains and reshape landscapes. The conflict erupted across the breadth of existence. In the sky, the air itself became a battlefield. On earth, the ground split open with the violence of the struggle. In the depths of the sea, Oceanus and his children fought against the forces of the new gods. The older generation of gods and titans stood against their children and the beings born from their unions. It was a family war, in the truest sense, a struggle between parent and child, between old authority and new power, between an established order and a revolutionary change. Iapetus fought alongside Kronos against Zeus and his siblings. Menecius, Atlas's brother, fought fiercely as well, attacking the younger gods with fury and rage. Prometheus, too, initially stood with his father and brothers. Atlas distinguished himself in the war, leading charges, commanding troops, standing against the forces arrayed against his family. But as the war progressed, Prometheus saw something that his brothers did not. He saw that the younger gods would prevail, not because they were stronger individually, though some were quite mighty, but because they were more numerous, and because they represented something new, something that the cosmos itself seemed to require. They had come into existence despite Kronos' attempts to prevent it, which suggested that their emergence was inevitable, written into the fabric of fate itself. There is a moment in every great conflict when one side begins to understand that defeat is inevitable. For Prometheus, this moment came during the war. He made a choice that his brothers did not make. He left his father's side. He stopped fighting for Kronos. Instead, he approached Zeus and offered his support. He told the younger god that resistance was futile, that the Titans would fall, that the future belonged to Zeus and his siblings. This act of foresight, this ability to see which way the cosmic winds were blowing, would define Prometheus for all the ages to come. It would spare him from the worst of the punishments that followed. It would also bring him into conflict with Zeus later, but that conflict would be of a different nature than what fell upon the other Titans. His brother Menecius was not so wise. He fought fiercely for the Titans throughout the war, and showed no signs of surrender or understanding. His recklessness, his refusal to see the inevitable defeat, made him stand out as a particularly fearsome opponent to the younger gods. He attacked some of the most powerful of them, fighting with such fury that it took the direct intervention of Zeus himself to stop him. When at last the divine king struck Menecius down, he did not simply defeat him. He smote him with the force of a thunderbolt, a blow so terrible that it sent Menecius far from the light of the sun, deep into the darkness of Erebus, that shadowy realm beneath the earth. There, Menecius was thrust into oblivion, forgotten and alone, his name fading from the world above. Unlike his brothers, who would still be discussed, still be remembered, still be part of the grand narrative of the cosmos, Menecius simply ceased to matter. His punishment was not torture, or binding, or eternal labor. It was erasure. Epimetheus, Atlas's other brother, survived the war, but did not escape consequence. Later, he would accept the gift of Pandora from the gods, a woman of terrible beauty, who brought with her a sealed jar. Epimetheus, who lacked his brother Prometheus's foresight, did not question the gift or wonder why the gods were offering him anything at all. Did he suspect treachery? Did he sense the danger? The texts do not say. He simply accepted, as his nature dictated. When Pandora opened the jar, either deliberately or by accident, depending on the version of the story, all the ills of the world poured out. Disease, hunger, pain, war, grief, and countless sufferings that had never been known before. Only hope remained at the bottom of the jar, trapped beneath the sealed lip, prevented from escaping with all the other evils. This would be Epimetheus's burden, to know that his trusting nature, his inability to foresee consequences, had unleashed suffering upon all of humanity. Where Prometheus was punished for giving fire to man, Epimetheus was punished simply for being gullible enough to accept a gift from the gods. In some ways, this was the crueler punishment, because it was deserved less clearly. Epimetheus did not act out of defiance or heroism. He simply failed to see the trap. But Epimetheus's fate lay in the future. At the end of the Titanomachi, as the dust settled and the younger gods surveyed the ruins of their victory, it was Atlas who stood before them, unbroken, unconquered by any individual opponent, though conquered nonetheless by the tide of war itself. Atlas had fought with terrible ferocity throughout the conflict. He had led assaults that shook mountains. He had marshaled forces that seemed unstoppable. He had stood against the younger gods with a warrior's skill and impressed even his enemies. Those who faced him in battle spoke of his strength with a mixture of fear and awe. He could fight for days without showing signs of fatigue. His weapons, great clubs of stone or bronze, enhanced by Titan power, could shatter mountains. His bare hands could crush buildings. But in the end, even his strength was not sufficient. The war was not decided by any single champion or any one-on-one combat. It was decided by the cumulative force of destiny, by the overwhelming power of the new gods working in concert, by the simple fact that there were more of them, and they possessed abilities that could not be easily overcome. As the tide of war turned irreversibly against the Titans, as Kronos himself was wounded and weakened, as the last great strongholds of the old order fell, Atlas was captured. It was not a capture that came from overwhelming him in direct combat. No single god could do that. Rather, it was the inevitable consequence of being on the losing side of war that had already been decided. Zeus himself came before Atlas at the end. The king of gods, victorious, powerful, radiant with the force of his triumph, stood face to face with the great Titan. Both of them understood what this meeting meant. The war was over. The old order was finished. A new age was beginning. What passed between them in that moment is not recorded in detail. Did they speak? Did Atlas beg mercy? Did Zeus offer a choice? Did they fight one final time, knowing that the outcome was predetermined? The ancient texts are largely silent on these crucial details, but the judgment came down swift and terrible. Zeus would not execute Atlas as he had, in his fury, destroyed Menetius. Nor would he merely imprison him in Tartarus with the other defeated Titans, that deepest and darkest of prisons where Kronos himself was chained beneath the earth, guarded by the 100-handed giants called the Hekatonchires. No, Zeus devised something more specific, more personal, more perfectly designed to be an eternal testament to his power and Atlas's defiance. The sentence was this: Atlas would be taken to the western edge of the world, to the place where the sun descended into the ocean at the end of each day, where the golden gates of Helios's palace stood where the boundary between the known world and the void beyond grew thin. There, at that remote and terrible place, far from the cities and lands of gods and men, Atlas would hold up the heavens themselves, not metaphorically, not as a figure of speech or a poetic abstraction, not symbolically or in some spiritual sense. He would literally support the sky, the stars, the celestial spheres, all the cosmic machinery of the heavens, with his own strength. He would bear their weight upon his shoulders until the end of time itself. Think about this for a moment. Let it settle into your mind. This was not merely imprisonment. This was not even merely punishment in the way a mortal punishment is conceived. This was an eternal, inescapable burden. Every second of every day, forever, Atlas would feel the weight of everything that is not earth pressing down upon him. The sky vast beyond comprehension, all of its stars and space and cosmic force, all of it resting on his shoulders. Consider the physics of such a thing, even in a mythological context. The sky in the ancient worldview was not empty space. It was not invisible or immaterial. It was a substance, a sphere, a thing with weight and substance and presence. It pressed down from above with a force proportional to the size of the cosmos itself. The stars were embedded in it like jewels in a dome. The sun crossed it daily in his chariot, driven by horses of flame. The moon traced its path through it, accompanied by her attendants. Clouds formed in it. Winds moved through it. All of this weight, all of this cosmic substance, now rested on the shoulders of a single being. Imagine taking the physical heavens and placing them on your shoulders. Imagine the weight of stars, billions and billions of them, each one massive beyond the comprehension of mortal minds, all pressing down. Imagine the weight of the sun, that great ball of fire and substance that stands at the center of celestial mechanics. Imagine the weight of all the celestial machinery It keeps the cosmos in its proper order. Then imagine that weight resting on two shoulders, on the back of one being, forever. This was Atlas's punishment. This was his crime and its consequence. Atlas was taken to the edge of the world. There are various descriptions of this place in the ancient texts. Some say it was in the far west, beyond the lands known to Greeks, in a region where the sun descended each day into the waters of Oceanus. Others describe mountains that rose so high that they seemed to touch the sky itself. Still others speak of a place where the earth grew thin, where the boundary between the world of substance and the realm of the divine grew blurred and permeable. There, at that remote and terrible place, far from the familiar lands and the cities of gods and men, far from the temples and sanctuaries, where beings might occasionally find moments of respite or comfort, Atlas took his position. His feet were planted firmly on the ground. His legs were set in a stance that would not shift. His shoulders rose to meet the heavens. He reached up with his massive arms and his great hands, and he took hold of the sky. The weight was immediate and absolute. It did not build gradually. It did not come in waves. It did not increase over time as his body adjusted to supporting it. It was simply there, the full, complete, total weight of everything above, pressing down with a force that no mortal could comprehend, and that even a Titan would find nearly unbearable. The moment Atlas took hold of the sky, the moment he put his shoulders beneath it, the weight descended, and yet he did not collapse. His legs did not buckle beneath him. His knees did not bend, or if they did, only slightly, in a posture that would become permanent. His back did not break. His arms did not give way. His hands maintained their grip on the celestial sphere. This was the terrible gift of being a Titan, to be strong enough to bear what would destroy anything lesser, yet not strong enough to escape the burden. He was perfectly constructed for this punishment. His body was designed precisely to be able to hold up the sky, no more, no less. He could not collapse. He could not die. He could only continue. Thousands of years passed. The world changed below Atlas's feet, but he could not look down to see it. He could not turn his head. He could not move except to maintain his stance. Thousands of years became tens of thousands. The oldest kingdoms that had ever existed came and went. Civilizations rose and fell. Empires conquered the world and then crumbled. The human species went from primitiveness to sophistication and back again. But Atlas remained. The burden did not ease with time. There is no adaptation to bearing the sky. There is no way that a being's body or mind can grow accustomed to supporting the entire cosmos on its shoulders. Each moment was as difficult as the first. The weight was constant, unvarying, absolute. There was no relief, no respite, no moment of ease. Atlas could not rest. He could not close his eyes and escape into sleep or dreams, for the weight was there, whether his eyes were open or closed. He could not lose consciousness, because his Titan nature would not permit it. He was condemned to be awake, to be aware, to feel the weight continuously. There is a particular torture in this. The human mind can adapt to many things. A person living in noisy cities learns not to hear the noise. A person dealing with chronic pain often finds that their mind learns to filter it out, to make it less prominent in their consciousness. But the mind cannot truly adapt to a burden that is absolute, that fills the entire scope of existence, that leaves no room for anything else. For Atlas, the weight was not something in addition to his life. It was his life. It was the totality of his existence. Day after day, Atlas experienced the cycle of light and dark. The sun rose and moved across the sky, a sky that rested on his shoulders, and then descended into the west. With each sunset, Atlas might have thought of the brief respite of nighttime, but there was no true respite. The stars rose in the night, filling the sky with their cold light, and they weighed just as much as the sun did. The moon rose full and pregnant with its own weight, and pressed down with its gravitational force. And still the cycle continued. The ancient Greeks who told this story sometimes imagined Atlas adjusting his burden, shifting from one shoulder to another, trying to distribute the weight more evenly. They imagined him straining beneath the load, his great muscles trembling with effort, his face twisted in the agony of perpetual struggle. They imagined him crying out in pain, his voice echoing across the empty western lands where he stood alone. But what would crying out accomplish? Who was there to hear him? In the remotest corners of the world, with no one nearby, no one to come to his aid, no one to offer comfort or hope, Atlas's cries would simply echo and fade. They would disappear into the vast emptiness of the cosmos. And then he would have to continue, pulling himself together, gripping the sky again with renewed resolve, because the alternative to let the sky fall, to fail in his burden, was not an option. In the first days of his punishment, perhaps Atlas felt rage. Perhaps he railed against the injustice of it, against Zeus and the other gods, against his own fate. Perhaps he struggled fiercely against his bonds, physical bonds, for there were none, but the bonds of duty and the binding constraints of the punishment itself. Perhaps he told himself that this was temporary, that surely some rescue would come, that his brothers would intervene, that the universe would eventually right itself, and he would be released. But as the years turned into decades, and the decades into centuries, and the centuries into millennia, rage gave way to other emotions. Despair came, surely, in waves. There would be moments when the weight seemed not merely difficult, but absolutely unbearable, when it felt as if the universe itself was malevolent in its design, when Atlas was tempted to simply let go, to allow the sky to fall and crush him in the process, if only to escape the endless burden. In his mind, he must have replayed the Titanomachy countless times, considering different choices he could have made, different decisions that might have led to a different outcome. If only he had defected with Prometheus. If only he had seen, before the war even began, that the future belonged to Zeus. If only he had fought less fiercely, had not earned the special attention of the king of gods. If only, if only, if only. These thoughts must have haunted him through the long ages. But alongside the despair would come other things. Resignation, perhaps. A Titan's acceptance that he was caught in a cosmic punishment, and that there was no escape from it. There would be no rescue. There would be no reprieve. There would be no end until the world itself ended, and perhaps not even then. This acceptance, though dark, also brought a kind of peace. If there was no escape, then struggling against the bonds was pointless. If the burden was eternal, then there was no point in measuring time by how much longer it might last. Routine came to Atlas as well, for even in the most hopeless situations, the mind creates routine. It is one of the most fundamental coping mechanisms of consciousness. Atlas would wake not that he ever truly slept, but he would experience the transition from night to day. He would feel the weight. He would endure. He would wait for the end of the day. A cycle would repeat. After thousands of years, this routine became the fabric of his existence. He no longer truly hoped for release, though hope might flicker in him occasionally, like a dying flame. He had simply become a being that held up the sky, and that was the totality of his nature in this age of punishment. The western edge of the world was a place of mystery to the ancient Greeks. It was beyond the lands they knew, beyond the territories they had explored, beyond even the distant areas that traders and adventurers had reached. It was the very edge of creation, the boundary between the known and the unknown. In that remote place, Atlas stood visible only to the most intrepid travelers, and sometimes not even to them, because the places where the sky seemed lowest and closest to the earth were often shrouded in mist or mysterious darkness. Mortals rarely saw him. The western edge of the world was remote and forbidding. There were no cities there, no ports where ships could safely land, no roads that led easily to that distant shore. The few travelers who ventured that far reported back stories of a great giant, his shoulders buried in clouds, his body merging with the mountains. Some said his knees were bent under the strain of the weight, his legs angled in a posture of perpetual strain. Others said his arms were raised to shoulder height, perpetually supporting his burden. Still others reported that he never moved at all, that he was like a living mountain, a permanent fixture of the landscape, part of the terrain itself. There are descriptions of Atlas in the ancient texts that paint a picture of terrible beauty. His body was described as being weathered by eons of exposure to the elements. His skin, in some accounts, had taken on the quality of stone, hardened and ancient-looking. His hair, which hung down his massive back, had grown wild and untended for ages. His eyes, when visible, stared upward in eternal vigilance, watching the celestial sphere that he bore. In other accounts, he was described as still possessing a terrible beauty, his features noble and tragic, his posture speaking of both strength and despair. Some of the ancient texts suggest that Atlas could still think, still reflect, still maintain some measure of consciousness about his situation, even after ages had passed. Others suggest that he had become almost like an automaton, a being of pure strength and will, maintaining his burden not through conscious effort, but through sheer force of being. The truth, likely, lay somewhere between these two extremes. The most famous encounter with Atlas came when Heracles, the greatest of all Greek heroes, needed his help. Heracles was a man of extraordinary strength, much greater than any mortal, though less than a god or a titan. He was the son of Zeus and Alcmene, a mortal woman, and he inherited some of his father's power, though he lived a mortal life and eventually died. But before his death, he undertook 12 labors, impossible tasks set for him by the gods, trials designed to test him and prove his worth. One of these labors was to retrieve the golden apples of the Hesperides. The Hesperides were nymphs who tended a miraculous garden at the western edge of the world, not far from where Atlas stood. These apples were not mere fruit. They were objects of divine power, capable of granting immortality or renewed youth to anyone who consumed them. They were guarded jealously, kept in a secret location, protected by various magical means. Heracles, armed with his club and his lion skin and his courage, undertook a journey across the known world, through great dangers and impossible tasks. His strength carried him through trials that would have destroyed any normal man. He faced monsters and murderers. He overcame obstacles that seemed utterly impassable. But when he reached the western edge of the world and found Atlas still bearing the sky, Heracles understood that he had reached a point where mere strength would not be sufficient. The two beings, the mortal hero and the immortal Titan, regarded each other across the empty landscape. Atlas had stood alone for so many centuries that the appearance of another being must have been a shock to his senses. Heracles, for his part, was looking upon a legend made manifest, a being of myth and story standing before him in the flesh. The two spoke, if a being caught in eternal punishment could truly be said to speak to a mortal hero. The conversation between them is not recorded in detail in the ancient sources, but the outline of their exchange is clear. Heracles asked Atlas for help. He explained his need to obtain the golden apples from the garden of the Hesperides. He asked if Atlas, who stood so close to the garden, who knew these lands intimately, could perhaps retrieve the apples for him. Atlas considered the request. For so long he had stood alone bearing his burden. For so many ages, no one had asked anything of him except to continue, to persist, to maintain his stance beneath the sky. Now, a hero, a being of great fame and strength, was coming to him with a specific request. What must it have meant to Atlas? What must it have felt like to be asked for help instead of simply being expected to suffer? According to the accounts, Atlas made an offer. He said that he could indeed retrieve the apples from the garden of the Hesperides. He knew the way. He knew which trees bore fruit and which did not. He knew the secrets of that hidden place. But there was a condition. If Heracles would take the sky from his shoulders and hold it while Atlas went to the garden, then he would undertake the task. He would fetch the apples and return with them. Heracles agreed. Perhaps he did not fully understand what he was agreeing to. Perhaps he simply saw it as a temporary exchange, a brief moment of burden-bearing in return for assistance with his labor. Perhaps he was confident enough in his own strength to think that bearing the sky for a short time would be manageable. Heracles moved beneath the vast dome of the heavens. He positioned himself so that his shoulders were beneath the celestial sphere. And then Atlas slowly, carefully, stepped away from his eternal post. For the first time in thousands of years, the weight was gone from his shoulders. What must that moment have felt like? For so long, longer than mortal minds can truly comprehend, Atlas had known nothing but the pressure, the weight, the burden. Every moment of consciousness had been accompanied by that weight. It was the baseline of his existence. It was the constant that had defined everything about his being. And now, suddenly, it was gone. For a moment, Atlas felt what it was like to be free. His shoulders could relax. His arms could drop. His muscles, which had been locked in tension for ages, could begin to ease. The constant pressure that had defined every moment of his existence was suddenly absent. One might imagine that this would be a moment of pure joy, a moment of transcendent relief, a moment when Atlas understood what it meant to be free again. But it was not. Instead, there was a terrible emptiness, a confusion born of the sudden absence of that which had become the defining feature of his reality. Atlas had been shaped by the weight. His entire existence had been constructed around bearing it. To be free of it was to be unmade, to suddenly be a being with no purpose, with no function, with no clear reason for existence. In a strange way, bearing the sky had given Atlas meaning. Without it, he was lost. But Atlas turned and walked away from his post. He walked toward the Garden of the Hesperides, carrying with him the strange experience of freedom. It had been so long since he had moved with his own will, had taken steps of his own choosing, had done anything other than stand and bear. The sensation was overwhelming in its own way, a kind of intoxication born of novelty. The journey to the garden could not have been easy. Even moving, even using his own will to travel, Atlas may have been uncertain about the nature of the world he was re-entering. But he reached the garden. He found the trees that bore the golden apples. He gathered them. According to some accounts, he had to overcome guards or magical protections, but his knowledge of the place and his Titan power were sufficient. And then Atlas returned. He came back to the place where Heracles stood, bearing the weight of the sky. According to the accounts, this is where the true test of the myth occurs in this moment of return. Now came the question that defines the entire encounter. Would Atlas take the sky back from Heracles and resume his eternal burden? Would he return to captivity? Would he reclaim his punishment and release the mortal hero? Some accounts say he would not. Some say that Atlas, having tasted freedom for however brief a moment, found that he could not bring himself to return to the weight. He had carried it for so long, accepted it, made it part of his identity. But now, having felt what it was like to be free, to move of his own volition, to be a being with choices rather than a being shaped entirely by burden, he could not bring himself to go back. In these versions of the story, Atlas made a proposal to Heracles. He said, "You carry the sky for a moment longer. I will take the golden apples to King Eurystheus myself. I will complete your labor for you. And you can leave this place. You can return to your life. Let me carry the burden in your stead and take my place in the world. I will be your representative, your servant, your tool. Only let me be free of my eternal punishment." It was a betrayal of sorts, a trade of one hero's immortal burden for a Titan's final escape. It was also desperate and beautiful and tragic, all at once. Here was a being who had endured for ages, who had accepted his punishment and made it part of his nature, but who could not resist the taste of freedom when it was offered. But Heracles was clever, or perhaps fortune favored him. Understanding that he had been maneuvered into a dangerous position, that Atlas had no intention of resuming his burden, Heracles came up with a deception. He asked if Atlas would hold the sky just for a moment longer, while Heracles adjusted the padding on his shoulders, the binding that kept the weight from crushing him entirely. It was a small request, a reasonable request, a request that should take only moments to fulfill. Atlas, understanding neither the deception nor perhaps too eager to help, took the sky back from Heracles' shoulders. He resumed his eternal posture. He took the weight back upon himself. And Heracles, freed from the burden, walked away. According to most versions of the story, Heracles took the golden apples and departed. He completed his labor. He returned to civilization and to his other tasks. Atlas remained at the edge of the world, bearing the sky as he always had, as he always would. Thus Atlas returned to his eternal punishment. The brief taste of freedom, or perhaps it was a delusion, an experience that was not truly freedom, but only an illusion created by the gods to test his resolve, faded. The weight returned. The ages continued. Some versions of this story end there. Others suggest that Heracles did eventually return to free Atlas, or that he arranged for someone else to do so. Some claim that when Heracles ascended to godhood after his death, he took upon himself the burden of the sky, finally granting Atlas the release that had been denied him for so long. But in the most common telling, Atlas simply remained, as he always had, bearing the weight of the sky until the end of the world. What does the weight of the sky mean? This is the question that has resonated through millennia of human interpretation. It is a question that ancient philosophers pondered, that medieval scholars debated, that modern readers still grapple with when they encounter the myth. On the surface, the punishment is clear enough: Zeus making certain that Atlas suffered for his defiance during the Titanomachi. It is retribution. It is a demonstration of power. It is a warning to any other beings who might consider rising against the king of the gods. But it is also something more than that. It is a meditation on burden itself, on the things we carry, on the weights that seem impossible to bear, yet are borne nonetheless. It is a story about the nature of punishment, and whether punishment can ever truly be just. It is a story about what it means to be trapped in a situation of one's own making, even when one did not know it was being made at the time. Every human being carries an invisible sky. It may not be as dramatic as Atlas's cosmic burden, but it is no less real. There are responsibilities that we cannot escape, that we must carry even when they seem too heavy. There are promises we have made, or that have been made for us, or that we have implicitly agreed to through the mere fact of existing. There are expectations, internal and external, that weigh upon our shoulders every single day. There are griefs we carry, losses we cannot set down, griefs that do enlighten with time, but become so familiar that we forget we are even carrying them. Consider the parent who works multiple jobs to support their children. Consider the caregiver who watches over an aging parent or a disabled sibling, year after year, with no relief and no end in sight. Consider the person carrying a secret shame, bearing a burden that they cannot share with anyone, that isolates them even as it binds them. Consider the student who carries the weight of expectation, the weight of family hopes and dreams, the weight of trying to become something that others have decided they should be. These are the skies that mortals bear. They are not as visible as Atlas's cosmic burden, not as dramatically described in ancient texts, but they are no less real. They press down with their weight. They limit what we can do, how we move, how we exist in the world. And like Atlas, many of us continue to bear them. The myth of Atlas speaks to the human condition in a way that few other myths do. It does not celebrate heroism in the moment of triumph. It does not reward cleverness or strength or bravery with victory and joy. Instead, It shows a being incredibly powerful by any standard, who is nonetheless trapped in an inescapable situation. It shows that power, no matter how great, is not a guarantee of freedom. It shows that punishment can be so perfectly designed that it cannot be evaded, not by any means. And yet, and here is the strange hope embedded in the myth, Atlas does not die. For all the weight, for all the eons, he does not collapse. He does not surrender. He does not give up. Day after day, he bears the sky. Year after year, century after century, millennium after millennium, he continues to hold up the heavens. In that endurance, there is a kind of nobility. In that persistent strength, there is a kind of tragic beauty. Atlas becomes, in some strange way, greater than his punishment. He becomes the thing that holds the cosmos in its proper place. The myth suggests something important about the relationship between suffering and identity. When we suffer for a long time, when we bear a burden for years or decades or a lifetime, that burden becomes part of who we are. It shapes us. It defines us. In a very real sense, Atlas becomes the being that bears the sky. That is not merely his punishment. That is his nature, his essence, his purpose. Remove the burden, and he ceases to understand himself. Give him freedom, and he discovers that he does not know who he is without the burden to define him. This is a profound and disturbing insight. It suggests that our suffering can become so integrated into our identity that we cannot imagine ourselves without it. It suggests that freedom, when it comes, might not be the relief we think it will be, but rather a kind of loss. Atlas, in the moment when he is freed from his burden, when Heracles takes the sky from his shoulders, does not immediately rejoice. Instead, he experiences confusion and emptiness. This is not because his punishment was not terrible. It is because his punishment had become the fundamental organizing principle of his existence. In the ancient world, these stories were told around fires at night. People looked up at the sky and thought of Atlas, thought of his burden, thought of the weight that was being held up by the hands of a Titan. In a way, it made them feel less alone. It said that the weight they carried might be necessary, might be part of a larger cosmic order. It said that they were not the only ones bearing something unbearable. It said that a being could persist, could continue, could maintain strength and dignity, even under a burden that seemed impossible. In the modern world, we have different stories. We have science to explain why the sky does not fall. We have physics and astronomy, and the understanding that the Earth spins in space without any visible support. We no longer believe, in any literal sense, that Atlas is holding up the heavens. The universe operates according to gravitational principles and cosmic forces that have nothing to do with Titan's shoulders. And yet the myth persists. We still speak of someone as being an Atlas when they bear great responsibility. We still look to the image of Atlas, bow backed beneath his burden, and we understand something true about the human condition. The word Atlas itself has become embedded in our language and culture in ways that preserve the memory of this myth. An atlas, the collection of maps, is named after this. Titan precisely because early editions bore the image of Atlas on their cover, holding up the world. The connotation is clear and intentional. An atlas is something that bears, that holds up, that supports and enables. To be an atlas is to be a foundation, a bearer of weight, a support for others. In this, the myth has been transformed and adapted, but its essential meaning remains intact. There are various interpretations of what happened to Atlas in later ages, after the encounter with Heracles. Some texts suggest that Perseus, another great hero, came to him at some distant point in time. Perseus, the son of Zeus and the mortal woman Danae, had obtained the head of the Medusa, that terrible Gorgon whose very gaze could turn a being to stone. According to these accounts, Perseus came to the western edge of the world where Atlas stood, and for some reason, perhaps by accident, perhaps deliberately, He showed the Medusa's head to the Titan. When Atlas saw the face of the Medusa, his body began to change. Stone crept through his flesh, hardening muscle and sinew and bone. He could not flee. He could not close his eyes against the sight. He could not shield himself. The transformation was inevitable and unstoppable. In a matter of moments, the living Titan had become a statue, a monument to his own suffering. His eternal burden was now carried by an eternal being of stone, the Atlas Mountains, which still bear his name and which still seem to touch the sky. In this reading, Atlas's punishment ends not with freedom, but with petrification, his final form being that of mountains themselves, that hold up nothing, but hold themselves, holding themselves for all eternity. It is a kind of mercy, in a way the cessation of suffering through transformation into something else entirely. No longer does Atlas feel the weight with his conscious mind, because he has become the weight. No longer does he suffer, because his consciousness has been replaced by the simple, eternal being of stone. He has become part of the landscape itself, part of the world that he once bore. In this transformation, there is a strange kind of peace. Other versions of the myth suggest a different outcome. They suggest that when Heracles died and ascended to godhood, for Heracles was the son of Zeus and achieved a kind of divinity that extended beyond mere mortality, he took over the burden of the heavens from Atlas. In this reading, Atlas's freedom comes not through escape, but through substitution, through the sacrifice of another. It is a redemptive reading in which suffering is ultimately not pointless, in which the burden eventually passes to someone willing to take it. Heracles, having learned something through his trials, through his 12 labors, through his struggles and suffering, becomes willing to take on the burden that Atlas can no longer bear. And Atlas, finally, is released. This reading is perhaps more comforting than the others. It suggests that suffering can lead to redemption, that burdens can eventually be lifted, that there are beings who care enough to take on great weights on behalf of others. It transforms the myth from a story of endless punishment into a story of eventual grace. But it is not the most common reading, and the ancient texts do not strongly support it. Still other versions suggest that Atlas remains at the edge of the world even now, in the age of human astronomy and scientific understanding, still bearing the sky, still carrying his ancient burden. In this reading, the myth becomes eternal, existing outside of time, a permanent feature of the cosmos that exists in the collective unconscious of humanity, even as we have put the ancient gods away. Atlas continues to bear the weight, age after age, and will do so until the end of time itself, if such an end exists. The burden is not a punishment for a finite time. It is the nature of existence itself. This reading transforms Atlas from a historical figure in mythological time, a being who suffered a specific punishment for a specific crime, into something archetypal, something fundamental, something that exists on a level deeper than history or narrative. In this interpretation, Atlas is not merely a Titan condemned by Zeus. He is the embodiment of burden itself, a symbol of all beings who carry what seems impossible to carry. The truth of the myth is not in its literal details, which vary from version to version and source to source. The truth is in its emotional and psychological resonance. The truth is in the moment when Atlas almost escapes, almost tastes freedom after eons of bondage, and then chooses or is tricked into returning to his burden. The truth is in the understanding that some captivities are inescapable, some punishments are eternal, and some beings can only find dignity in endurance. What was Atlas thinking in those rare moments when his mind was not entirely consumed by the weight? Did he remember his childhood, those early days before the Titanomachy, when the world was new and his fate was not yet sealed? Did he remember running across fields, playing with his brothers, engaging in the games and competitions that young Titans enjoyed? Did he remember what it felt like to be strong and free, to use his strength for purposes of his own choosing, rather than merely holding up the cosmic machinery? Did he remember his father, Iapetus, who had been sent to Tartarus during the war? Did he think of his father's fate and wonder if his father thought of him, somewhere in that deep place of imprisonment? Did he wonder if his father knew what had become of him, or if his father was too consumed with his own suffering to think of his sons? Did he think of his brothers Prometheus, bearing his own punishment on a distant mountain, an eagle eating his liver daily while he regenerated? Epimetheus free in some sense, but knowing that his trusting nature had unleashed all the world's suffering. Menetius, forgotten in the depths of Erebus, erased from the memory of the world, existing in a darkness so complete that he may as well not exist at all. Did Atlas wonder if his punishment was just? By what measure could bearing the entire sky be considered a proportional response to fighting in a war? Even if he had fought on the losing side, even if he had opposed Zeus directly, was this punishment not a bit extreme? Even criminals in the mortal world receive punishments proportional to their crimes. A thief did not lose his life. A murderer, in some societies, could be exiled or made to serve. But to bear the entire cosmos on one's shoulders for eternity? What crime could justify such a punishment? But then again, who could he complain to? To whom could he appeal? Zeus was the king of gods and the author of his punishment. The other gods, younger and now in power, had no reason to help a defeated Titan. The Titans themselves were imprisoned or scattered, and the mortals who occasionally glimpsed him in those remote western lands could do nothing but observe and tell stories about what they saw. They could not change his fate. They could not negotiate with Zeus on his behalf. They could only spread the story, keep the memory alive, maintain the narrative. Perhaps in the depths of his being, Atlas came to understand that the punishment was not about justice at all, in any measure that humans would understand. It was about power pure, simple, and absolute. Zeus wanted to ensure that the order of the cosmos was maintained, that there could be no rebellion. That defiance against the will of the new king of gods would result in consequences so terrible that none would dare to challenge his authority again. Atlas was an example. He was a warning written across the landscape in the form of a Titan's eternal struggle. The other Titans, chained in Tartarus, could see his fate if they had eyes to see it. They could observe what happened to those who defied Zeus. They could understand the consequences of opposing the new order. And beings living in later ages, gods and mortals alike, could look to the western edge of the world and see Atlas still bearing his burden and know that this was what happened to those who fought against destiny. Yet even knowing this, even understanding that his punishment served a political purpose in the hierarchy of divine power, Atlas could not escape. He could not reason his way out of it. He could not appeal to any higher authority. He could not bargain his way out of it by offering to serve Zeus or to accept a reduced burden. He could not overpower his way out of it because he was no match for Zeus's divine authority. He could only endure. This is perhaps the deepest horror of the myth, not the weight itself, but the utter hopelessness. There is no escape clause. There is no court of appeal. There is no ending to the story until the world itself ends. Atlas is not imprisoned for a specific crime with a term that will eventually expire. He is not being punished for a finite period after which he will be released. He is in a condition that is meant to be permanent, meant to last as long as the cosmos itself lasts. As long as the sky exists, Atlas will bear it. The punishment is designed to be inescapable. This is its genius and its horror. It is not merely that the weight is heavy. Atlas could theoretically become stronger, could theoretically learn to bear it more easily. But no, the weight is not fixed. As Atlas grows stronger, as he develops new muscles and new capabilities, the weight grows proportionally. He will always be pushed to the very edge of his capability, always bearing as much as he can possibly bear, but never more than he can bear. He cannot collapse. He cannot die. He cannot surrender. He can only continue. But as the centuries turned into millennia, and the millennia turned into ages, something strange began to happen in the mind of Atlas, perhaps. Or perhaps nothing happened at all, and he simply continued as he always had, without thought, without change, without internal evolution. But in the stories that humans told about him, in the way the myth was transmitted and transformed across generations, Atlas began to change. He began to become less of a prisoner and more of a pillar. He became not a being suffering, but a being serving. The burden became, in the telling, not a punishment, but a responsibility. This is a very human transformation. We take our sufferings and seek to find meaning in them. We take our burdens and convince ourselves that they matter, that they serve some purpose, that our carrying of them makes a difference. A person working a difficult job to support their family reframes their work as noble. A person caring for an ill parent reframes their sacrifice as an act of love. A person dealing with a chronic illness reframes their struggle as a source of wisdom and growth. We are meaning-making creatures, and we use meaning to bear what would otherwise be unbearable. Atlas, in the story, gradually becomes not a victim of Zeus's wrath, but a necessary part of the cosmic machinery. He becomes noble precisely because his situation is hopeless, because he continues nonetheless. He becomes admirable because he does not give up, does not surrender, does not allow the weight to crush his spirit, even if it crushes his body. He becomes worthy of respect, perhaps, in a way that he was not when he was merely a Titan fighting for his father's cause. There is something deeply beautiful in this reframing, and something deeply dangerous. It is beautiful because it allows human beings to find dignity in their suffering and meaning in their burdens. A person facing cancer, facing loss, facing any kind of impossible weight can look to Atlas and see not despair, but a model of endurance. It is beautiful because it transforms victimization into a kind of heroism, because it allows people to own their suffering and make it part of their identity in a way that gives them power. It is dangerous because it can justify accepting unjust burdens. It can convince people to stop struggling against weights that perhaps should not have been placed on them in the first place. It can make them complicit in their own oppression. A person can be convinced to bear a burden, not because they must, but because bearing it has become virtuous. An oppressor can look at an oppressed person bearing their burden nobly and think, see, they accept their role, they are content with what they have been given. The reframing of punishment as noble endurance can be used as a tool of control. The real power of the Atlas myth lies in this tension, the tension between the injustice of the punishment and the nobility of the endurance, between the horror of the situation and the dignity of continuing nonetheless, between the temptation to escape and the understanding that escape may not be possible, between the desire to rebel and the necessity of acceptance. These tensions are never resolved in the myth. They are allowed to exist in uncomfortable coexistence. When Heracles met Atlas and took the burden for those few moments, it might seem like an escape was possible. But the myth teaches us that it was not. Atlas almost escaped, but did not. In some versions, he was tricked back into his burden. In others, he simply chose to return. The message is the same. There is no escape, not for him, and perhaps not for most of us either. The burdens we carry are our own, and we will carry them until the end. Yet the myth also says something else. It says that bearing the sky did not crush Atlas. It says that a being, no matter how burdened, could continue to exist. It says that even in the western extremes of the world, even at the very edge of creation, even under a weight that would destroy anything lesser, there could be endurance. It says that strength is not merely about power, it is about the will to continue, the refusal to collapse, the commitment to bearing what must be borne. In the ancient world, these stories were told around fires at night. People looked up at the sky and thought of Atlas, thought of his burden, thought of the weight that was being held up by the hands of a Titan. The night sky was full of stars, and each star was embedded in the celestial sphere that rested on Atlas's shoulders. They imagined those stars as jewels, as fixed points in the cosmos, as unchanging and eternal. And supporting all of it, making all of it possible, was a single being standing at the edge of the world, bearing the weight. In a way, these stories made people feel less alone. They said that the weight they carried might be necessary, might be part of a larger cosmic order. They said that they were not the only ones bearing something unbearable. They said that they were not unique in their suffering. They said that even gods and titans and beings of cosmic power had to carry burdens that seemed impossible. But the stories also did something else. They taught a lesson about the nature of punishment and power. They showed that might does not make right, that victory is not the same as justice, that those with power can impose burdens that those without power must bear. They showed that the powerful can reshape reality according to their will, and that the powerless must adapt to the new reality that has been created for them. They showed that even the greatest beings, titans, creatures of cosmic significance, could be reduced to servitude and burden-bearing. In the modern world, we have different stories. We have science to explain why the sky does not fall. We have physics and astronomy, and the understanding that the Earth spins in space without any visible support. We understand that gravity is not a being but a force, that the stars are not held in place by divine hands, but by the same gravitational forces that keep planets in their orbits and atoms in their nuclei. We no longer believe, in any literal sense, that Atlas is holding up the heavens. The universe operates according to principles that have nothing to do with Titan shoulders. And yet the myth persists. We still speak of someone as being an Atlas when they bear great responsibility. We still look to the image of Atlas, bow-backed beneath his burden, shoulders straining, and we understand something true about the human condition. We see in his frozen posture, in art, in sculpture, in imagination, the image of anyone bearing the unbearable. We see our parents, our teachers, our leaders, our workers, all of them bearing weights that seem too heavy. The Atlas, the collection of maps, remains named after this Titan. Early editions, particularly those published in the 16th century by Gerardus Mercator, bore the image of Atlas on their cover, the Titan holding up the world. This was not accidental. It was a deliberate choice to invoke the myth, to call to mind the image of a being bearing weight, of a foundation supporting everything above it. The name stuck. Even now, when we use an atlas to find our way through the world, we are invoking, however unconsciously, the image of Atlas bearing the weight of the cosmos. The connotation is clear and has been intentional for centuries. An atlas is something that bears, that holds up, that supports and enables. To be an atlas is to be a foundation, a bearer of weight, a support for others. In this, the myth has been transformed and adapted and put to use in ways that the ancient Greeks might not have anticipated, but its essential meaning remains intact. The word atlas means something that bears weight. Let us consider what would happen if Atlas were to be released. Let us imagine for a moment that through some cosmic event, through the intervention of a god or a hero, through some fundamental shift in the laws of the universe, Atlas were to be freed from his burden. What would happen to the sky? Who would hold it up? In one way, the myth's answer to this is simple. The sky would fall. Reality would collapse. The cosmic order would be unmade. Without Atlas bearing the heavens, the stars would plummet. The sun would descend. The moon would crash down. The orderly arrangement of the cosmos would dissolve into chaos. Atlas's burden is not merely a punishment. It is the price of cosmic order. It is the thing that makes existence possible. But in another way, this answer is troubling. It suggests that the cosmos itself is fragile, dependent on a single being's continued suffering for its survival. It suggests that the price of order is the eternal torture of one being. It suggests that the universe is fundamentally unjust, that it requires cruelty at its foundation to maintain itself. And perhaps this is true. Perhaps this is the hard wisdom that the myth is trying to teach us. Perhaps the universe is indeed built on suffering. Perhaps order is purchased with the pain of those who maintain it. Perhaps the beautiful, orderly cosmos that we see is only possible because somewhere, at the edges of creation, a being is bearing an impossible burden and will continue to bear it forever. This is a dark lesson, but it is one that many human beings have learned through their own experience. We understand, in some deep way, that the comfort and order of our lives may be purchased with the suffering of others. The beauty and order of ancient Rome was purchased with the pain of slaves. The prosperity of modern nations has been built, in many cases, on the exploitation and suffering of workers. The peace and order of our lives, in our homes and communities, is often maintained by the invisible labor of people whose suffering we do not see. The myth of Atlas suggests that this arrangement is fundamental, that it cannot be changed, that it is woven into the fabric of existence itself. The sky must be held up. The weight must be borne. Someone must carry the burden, and that someone will suffer for it. This is simply the nature of things. But the myth also suggests that even knowing this, even understanding that we may be complicit in systems that cause suffering, we are bound to continue. We are bound to maintain the structures and systems that we have inherited. We are bound to bear the weights that have been placed on our shoulders, whether we place them there or not. This is the source of the myth's power. It does not offer easy answers. It does not say that everything will be okay, that suffering has meaning, that the burden will eventually be lifted. It simply says, here is a being bearing an impossible weight. Here is what endurance looks like. Here is what it means to continue. And for many people, for many generations, this has been enough. The myth has provided a way of thinking about suffering that does not require that suffering to have meaning or purpose. It has provided a way of valuing endurance without requiring that the endurance be rewarded. It has provided a model for how to bear what must be borne. Even when bearing, it brings no relief and no hope of relief. In the modern age, we often seek to eliminate suffering. We use medicine to ease pain. We use psychology to understand trauma and reduce its impact. We use social movements to change systems that cause suffering. These are good things, and they have reduced suffering for many people. But the myth of Atlas reminds us that not all suffering can be eliminated. Some burdens must be borne. Some weights cannot be set down. The challenge, then, is to find a way to bear these necessary burdens with dignity, with grace, with as little additional suffering as possible. The challenge is to create systems and structures that distribute the weight more fairly, so that not all of it falls on a single being. The challenge is to recognize that those who bear invisible burdens, the workers, the caregivers, the builders, the maintainers, are performing essential services and deserve respect and support for doing so. The myth does not tell us how to do these things. It simply reminds us of the reality that there are necessary burdens, that they must be borne by someone, and that bearing them, in the long term, requires strength not just of body, but of spirit. There is one more thing to consider about the myth of Atlas, and that is the question of complicity. Atlas did not choose to bear the sky. The burden was imposed on him as a punishment. But in another sense, Atlas did choose. He chose to fight in the Titanomachi. He chose to stand against Zeus and the younger gods. He chose to oppose the inevitable course of events. In choosing to fight, in choosing to take a stand, Atlas knew that he was taking a risk. He did not know exactly what would happen if he lost. He could not have predicted his specific punishment, but he knew that defeat in a war of gods typically led to serious consequences. He chose to fight anyway. This raises a difficult question. To what extent is Atlas responsible for his own suffering? To what extent is he a victim of injustice? And to what extent is he suffering the consequences of his own choices? The myth does not answer this question directly, but it invites us to consider it. It invites us to think about the nature of responsibility and choice, and the relationship between action and consequence. It invites us to consider whether those who lose wars deserve the punishments they receive, or whether the punishments are simply the exercise of power by the victors. In the real world, we grapple with these questions constantly. When a person commits a crime, to what extent are they responsible for their crime? And to what extent are they the product of circumstances beyond their control? When a nation loses a war, to what extent should its people be punished, and to what extent should they be protected by principles of humanitarian law? When a person finds themselves in a difficult situation, to what extent are they responsible for their circumstances? And to what extent are they victims of bad luck or bad choices made by others? The myth does not answer these questions, but it suggests that the answers are not simple. It suggests that responsibility and victimization are not mutually exclusive. It suggests that a being can be both guilty of standing against the inevitable, guilty of fighting when they should have fled, and innocent of deserving such a terrible punishment, innocent of the cruelty of Zeus's justice. Atlas stands at the western edge of the world, bearing the sky. He chose to fight. He lost. He is now bearing the consequences. But he also did not deserve the consequences he is bearing. The punishment is disproportionate. It is cruel. It is unjust. And yet, it is the punishment he has received. This is a tragic vision. It is a vision in which justice is not guaranteed, in which the universe is not fair, in which those who oppose the will of the powerful may be crushed entirely, not merely defeated. It is a vision that runs counter to the modern idea of justice, in which we believe that punishments should be proportional and that the innocent should be protected. But it is also a vision that resonates with the real experience of many people. The world is not just. Those with power do crush those without power. Punishments are often disproportionate. Innocence is not always respected. The myth of Atlas acknowledges this dark reality, and in acknowledging it, it provides a way of thinking about it, a way of maintaining dignity in the face of injustice. In the end, Atlas remains at the edge of the world, his shoulders bowed, his hands raised to the heavens. He has been there for thousands of years. By all accounts, he will remain there for thousands more, perhaps forever. And in that endurance, in that refusal to break, despite the impossible burden, there is something that speaks to something fundamental. In the human soul, something that recognizes that we too are bearing something, that we too have weights upon our shoulders, that the only way forward is to continue bearing them as nobly as we can for as long as we must. The weight of the sky, the burden of existence, the price of order, the cost of continuity. These are the lessons of the myth of Atlas. These are the truths that have kept the story alive for thousands of years, that have made it relevant across cultures and centuries, that have given it power in the hearts and minds of people who hear it. And perhaps, in the end, that is the greatest gift the myth can give us. Not answers, not solutions, not a way out of our burdens, but a way of understanding them. A way of seeing our suffering as part of something larger, something cosmic, something that has been endured by mighty beings before us. A way of finding dignity in endurance, a way of continuing. For we are all, in some sense, Atlas. We are all bearing the sky.